How's everyone feeling? Antonio Fletcher back with you once again with another video. And today's video is going to be a response to Atheist Bionic Dance's video, Love, Torture, and God. Although I think Bionic Dance is a great artist, her arguments leave much more to be desired. So with that said, let's get into the video now.
Bionic Dance is filmed in front of a live studio audience.
Often, unbelievers have a hard time reconciling the doctrine of hell with an all-good God.
And why shouldn't we? In what system other than religion is allowing torture through neglect seen as virtuous behavior, the act of one who allegedly loves the person they've abandoned?
Right out the gate, I can see a fatal flaw with this logic. What is this business about torture through neglect? I find it very interesting a lot of atheists out there, like you Bionic Dance, have absolutely no issue with the methods of abortion used on the most precious and innocent among us after being neglected by their mothers that I would not even wish upon my worst enemy. Yet when God sees the hearts of humankind who would think this was okay, they get mad about God allegedly torturing through neglect. It makes no sense for you Bionic Dance to advocate for mothers making a choice that forever takes away the choices for that child that is killed, yet get upset when the people in hell who advocated for that choice has any choice to get out of hell taken away from them forever. Honestly, don't you find it interesting when people play God to make choices which impacts a life eternally, but when God pays that back eternally, it's all of a sudden a problem? These people want to play God, yet have a problem with God playing God, thinking he's wrong. Plain and simple, the hypocrisy of these people like Bionic Dance gets exposed real quick when you take a close look at their positions.
Let's do this. Greetings, fellow space travelers. Bionic Dance here. The concept of hell has always been, to me, one of the reasons I cannot believe in the Abrahamic God.
Notice she said, to her, hell was one of the reasons she cannot believe in the Abrahamic God. In other words, just her personal opinion. Not really anything legit she can actually argue.
The descriptions of the terms and conditions for entering hell, or its alleged polar opposite, heaven, has always sounded to me like blackmail. God tells us to do as he says, or else. And that or else is not otherwise we won't be friends. No, it's otherwise you'll be tortured forever.
Well, that's very interesting. Why is it she calls that blackmail? I mean, let's look at this issue very closely, logically. Let's say we take hell off the table and switch it with God simply poofing people out of existence who break his commands. What then? Do as I say, or else you get poofed out of existence? Still sounds like blackmail to me, by her logic. It may sound less severe, but still blackmail nonetheless. And let's say we even take that off the table and say there is no negative consequences for breaking his commands, like when she says, God doesn't say, or else we won't be friends. Then we just have a God who his creation can simply walk all over him. What exactly does Bionic Dance expect from God? What exactly would she argue a reasonable consequence should be for breaking God's laws? Any negative consequences God imposes for his commands being broken necessarily would sound like blackmail by the way she put it, do as I say or else, or just would downright make God look like a passive person who lets his creation walk all over him, as per her or else we won't be friends logic. From that perspective, there is no negative consequence that wouldn't be blackmail, so her statement, do as I say or else, is therefore absolutely meaningless. You have atheists all the time upset at standards God has, yet they are never able to argue better alternatives, while still staying consistent with God's nature.
Oh, right, and you don't get to know whether any of the above exists until it's too late to decide to play along. You ready to gamble? Strap in.
She is simply incorrect. Scripture has made it very clear in Romans 1:20, God has made it so people can know. This is why God commissions his followers to preach the gospel, which is the good news. The good news necessarily entails being warned of the bad news. It's not God's fault if you reject what God has made clear in Romans 1:20, as well as rejecting the warnings of believers who desire atheists to be saved. She clearly doesn't have a coherent concept of God either, because in biblical Christianity, it's not that God is hiding himself in some way from those who truly believe him, thus his followers are simply gambling. Furthermore, why does she care about the gambling point anyway? If she's truly convinced belief in God is so absurd, she should be confident enough the God concept is that absurd to her to make gambling irrelevant in her mind from the outset. Is she possibly insecure about her beliefs? I think it's something interesting to think about.
So, what can we say to help? Well, first, as the Catechism teaches in paragraph 1472, the punishment of hell is not a kind of vengeance inflicted by God from without, but follows from the nature of sin.
That doesn't make any sense at all. The bare facts are as I said. We didn't do as we were told, so your alleged God allegedly made a decision regarding our fate. This isn't difficult math. If you think something different, the nature of sin, apparently, I think you're engaging in a cop-out. But okay, let's hear you justify this.
I don't like it, therefore it doesn't make sense. That's literally all I heard from her now. Atheists like Bionic dance here are never satisfied with God's ways. They just like to whine left and right about what they perceive negatively about God. If God doesn't intervene and stop something bad from happening, God is evil. If God intervenes too much, he's being too imposing. If God doesn't intervene enough, he's hiding himself. They want God to act only when they decide God should act. They literally want to throw God's sovereignty out the window. So Bionic's argument here falls flat because the alternative to following God's commands is living in their own lives and circling God around their whims when it's most convenient. They don't want God to be God, which is why their argument simply gets thrown into the garbage where it belongs.
As C.S. Lewis writes in The Great Divorce, quote, "There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, 'Thy will be done,' and those to whom God says, 'Thy will be done,'" close quote. Hell is for the latter. All those there choose it.
The hell we don't get to know exists, as decreed by the God we don't know exists. We just hear it from his self-appointed representatives, who we're given no reason to trust. If we were given a similar choice by a human, we'd call it manipulative, passive-aggressive, and threatening. It sounds less like someone who loves us, and more like a manic, depressive, self-centered mob boss. Not a god, a godfather. If we wouldn't put up with this from a human, why does God get to be a big ol' exception?
It's interesting she treats God's commands like a mob boss thing, except for one critical detail she left out. God didn't just command, he served as a man. That's Jesus Christ. Typically, mob bosses don't die for their subordinates. So, if you factor in Jesus into the picture, then she would be saying that God gave his only begotten Son to suffer literally the worst death of all time, taking all the sins of humanity upon himself and being shamed, humiliated, and brutally beaten beyond any recognition to save us from hell, just so he could use hell as a threat? Is she kidding? Jesus didn't die for us just so he could use the very thing he wanted to save us from as a threat. If Bionic thinks God is that malevolent, then why die for us at all and not just send us straight to hell to begin with? God could easily make a new creation of people to worship him if he wanted. It seems obvious to me that Bionic dance is simply grasping at straws.
Now, if someone rejects God and doesn't wish to be with him, wouldn't it belong to God's goodness to not coerce that person into loving him and respect that person's free will? I think it would.
Maybe it would, but you'd think an omnibenevolent God could at least do us the favor of building some neutral ground where we could spend our eternity just hanging out without him. But no, instead he says, "Okay, you didn't lick my toes in humility. Go to hell and suffer forever." He doesn't care if you were generally a good person, didn't steal, didn't murder, said please and thank you to people in service jobs and tipped more than 15%. No, you didn't decide to be God's little bitch, and that is unforgivable.
Okay, all she's doing here is continuing to whine and rant, not really arguing for anything. She mentioned that God could have just left them in some neutral space without him, but this is just yet another example of her yet again wanting God to do things the way she thinks they should be done. She even wants say over the consequences for rebelling against his ways. She doesn't want God to be God, so her complaining about God doing something wrong, such as punishing his creation for not being his B-word, as she says, is blatantly hypocritical because she's projecting exactly what she would like God to be, her B-word.
And consider this. If God has to take us into heaven, and anybody who doesn't accept his rule ends up in hell, but this God isn't sending us there, we just end up there by default if we weren't good little fawning sycophants, then it sounds as if hell surrounds heaven, that heaven is actually like a bomb shelter against damnation. So who is actually more powerful, God or the devil? Think about it.
That literally did not prove anything. Who even says that heaven and hell have to even be in the same realm? That literally sounds like one of the most illogical things she said in this video so far.
If that's the case, well then the possibility of hell, which is definitive self-exclusion from God, is not incompatible with God's goodness.
Of course it's incompatible. Someone's goodness, God or human, shouldn't depend on someone else's behavior. Even if we've either rejected God or not believed the legends his human representatives have told us, an omnibenevolent being would still love us, want to protect us, wouldn't allow us to be tortured for eternity. He'd understand that he was kind of a shitty parent figure, recognize that demanding love and loyalty despite not giving us definitive proof of his existence is kind of an asshole thing to do, and that sending us to hell for his mistake is even worse. If you believe that allowing eternal torture for people who had the temerity and gall to think for themselves and believe only that for which they had evidence is perfectly okay, I really, really hope you never have children, because your parenting skills are non-existent.
Here we go again, more opinionated crap and more whining. I might have to mess around and bust out the small violin at this point. There are many believers which are convinced by evidence, so just because she claims either there is no evidence or whatever evidence she's seen isn't good enough for her isn't an argument. Is she attempting to stand on some pedestal and have some greater view of what quote-unquote good evidence is above others? But here's my thing. Why is she whining about evidence anyway? For if she had convincing evidence shown to her, however she would define that, the only thing which would happen is it would lead her to this very being she finds evil and twisted beyond belief. It seems to me that wouldn't change her view about God one bit. And as far as God's goodness, the ultimate display of that was on the cross. But even after all that, people still spit in the face of Jesus. Why? Because the sins he died for to save them from, they still don't want to give up. The fact Jesus died for them wasn't enough. He had to die for them, yet still permit them to sin at the same time. If she wants to talk about incompatibility, Jesus dying and people still refusing his sacrifice and sinning, and Jesus is supposed to just overlook that for Bionic's bogus argument of quote-unquote goodness, could be more incompatible with his nature.
Furthermore, it belongs to God's goodness to make a distinction between loyal and disloyal subjects, and to give them their just deserts.
Okay, first of all, that's deserts, not desserts. Second, didn't you say before, and I quote,
"The punishment of hell is not a kind of vengeance inflicted by God from without."
You, sir, are not being consistent.
Actually, he said after that it follows from the nature of sin. That is in no way inconsistent with getting what is due. Because of the nature of sin and rebellion, those going to hell will get what they deserve in light of rejecting Jesus Christ. Not in the least inconsistent with what he said earlier. When you quote mine and cut people off like that, you're not being very honest, Bionic Dance. That was actually quite pathetic on your part.
Just like it wouldn't be good for parents to give their children's inheritance to a sibling who has rejected them all their lives, and then all of a sudden, without remorse mind you, comes a knocking when the parents are dying, so too it wouldn't be good for God to give heaven as a reward to his children that refuse to love him even until their death.
Boy, is that ever a false equivalency. You see, heaven is obviously not solely a reward. It's also safety, a refuge from the eternal torture of hell. Do you think these same parents in your inheritance example would only save the loyal child from a burning building and let the other one suffer and burn to death, even if they had the ability to save everybody? If protection from torture can only be a reward for obedient behavior, that is, as I said, blackmail, and not an act of a loving person, God or no God.
Her accusation of a false equivalency is baseless because those in rebellion from God aren't trying to escape from a burning building. Rather, they are being told the building is on fire, but refuse to acknowledge it's on fire. They make the choice to ignore it, and sadly ends up getting burned. In the same way, Christians are warning non-believers of the fire, and there will be many non-believers ignoring it and getting burned. No refuge can help you if you refuse to go to it. That has nothing to do with blackmail, not even remotely so, as I pointed out earlier in the video.
So, does hell contradict God's goodness? I don't think so.
Of course you don't. But people with one of those clue things you've probably read about do. Oh, and for the record, I've been to hell. I was there for 4 years. Okay, they called it high school. Same diff.
After the mountain of nonsense she argued in this video, of course she throws another cheap jab in there at the gentleman in the video. I think a lot of the garbage she argues is on par in absurdity with Jacqueline Glenn. At least her animations is good though. Well folks, thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Take care. God bless and peace.